just give us your name and the correct spelling.
My name is John Bernardoni. It's Bernardoni.
Tell me a little bit about what your company does.
The John Bernardoni Production Group is engaged in producing major stars for corporate America, Fortune 500 companies, the PGA, major sporting events. I do people like, I produced Hootie and the Blowfish in Hawaii for Lincoln Mercury, and I did Itzhak Perlman and McAllen for a Broadway series. And I guess I produced maybe 400 major stars in my life, and that's one of the things I do. I also have a company called Stepping Stone Communications, which produces and creates programming for space-related subjects, and we're working in tandem with NASA and the Johnson Space Center on a project called Millennium Mission Moon, Mars, and Beyond right now, which is going to be a multi-part television series on network television that will include and be a part of 100 interviews with astronauts and cosmonauts who really were responsible for making space travel famous and popular. And we're going to get some very interesting juxtapositions of people like Neil Armstrong with Titov and Gagarin's wife with Buzz Aldrin and this kind of thing that is going to be quite interesting. So we're going to break some new ground and shake some people up about some things they didn't know regarding space and why we should go into space in the future with a vengeance.
That's a whole other subject. That's great. Tell me how you got involved with theater renovation, and I don't know if there was a specific connection with Interstate, but primarily theater renovation.
Well, it started in a very indirect fashion in terms of how I got involved in theater restoration and Interstate. I was actually in California helping a friend out in the early 70s, and I went and saw Clockwork Orange at the Pacifica Theater in Hollywood. And that is one of the great, historic theaters, atmospheric theaters, sometimes they call them, from the 30s and the 20s. I don't know exactly the vintage. And I was watching the film, which was quite gripping, and then I think there was a break or something, and we walked around, and I was looking at this theater. My background is in legitimate theater, so naturally I would wonder about whether it was just a straight-ahead movie box type building with no rigging and grid system backstage. In other words, did it have a stage house or not? And it did. And I was walking around going, what in the world are they showing film in this incredible theater? Although I love it. And of course, in my early days as a child, I grew up in San Antonio, and we used to go to the Majestic, the Aztec, and the Texas on a regular basis. I saw all the James Bond movies at the Majestic. I saw Mothra and some of the Godzilla movies at the Texas Theater. So, I grew up, I was lucky to grow up with these kind of buildings as opposed to the 97 theater complex now that they have where you have a 2-inch screen in front of your face. And but anyway, what happened in California really inspired me. And I came back and I said, I think there's one in Austin. And there was the Paramount, and I had kind of barely remembered it from college, although I'd never been because it had shown, even at that time it was in a decline, and it was showing kung fu movies and other kind of what they call exploitation product, much to the dismay of Charlie Root, who was the manager then of the Interstate theaters, all of the ones that were in Austin at the time. And I went backstage at the Paramount, and was looking to see what was happening with the theater. There was a rigging, and in fact everything was intact. And I was really quite pumped up about this, and I guess a year went by before much happened about it. And it was my original vision to create a Guthrie theater, a regional repertory theater in the Paramount. The idea of restoration did not really occur to me initially. It's something that came a little bit down the road. It was primarily to use it as a living theater, not as a museum. And Charlie Root, who again was the general manager, a terrific guy, and had worked at the Paramount as an usher as a kid, and gone to the war and come back and had been the assistant manager, worked his way up in the ranks of Interstate. He hated the fact that this incredible theater really was reduced to the classic urban decline of having to show, the 5 flying fingers of death, which really was the title of a movie. I took a picture of the marquee, and other assorted kinds of movies of that ilk, and he had fought tenaciously to keep Triple X and really some of the hardcore, violent type films out of there and was successful. They never showed in the theater. But the Bruce Lee stuff at that time, which was not considered very artful, slipped in. And when he and I sat down and I told him what my dream was, which was to basically revitalize this theater, to turn it back into a performing arts center, he immediately just locked in with me and provided background, historical information, introduced me to people in Dallas, set up meetings where I could go and talk to them, introduced me to the people that owned the theater, which was not Interstate, introduced me to the bank, which had the estate that controlled the building. He was a very important catalyst for me to get moving, because I was quite young at the time. I was like 23 or 24, I didn't really know that much about business. And I had an extensive background in theater, don't get me wrong, but this was a pretty big project, and the theater was really, in for the most part, generally good shape. It was more cosmetic than anything that was really problematic in terms of the initial operation. But that was kind of how that moment in California kind of clicked a little fire in my mind about, that there was a higher and better use for these theaters, and it's like a cycle of life. We went back to the beginning of how most of these theaters began their way, which was with legitimate theater, vaudeville, and variety acts.
What was unique about how you eventually funded the restoration with the Paramount?
Well, it was incredibly unique because when I had two partners, Chuck Eckerman and Steve Scott, when we started this process. We started in '74, early '74, with Dave Brubeck as a test to see if anybody would come into the building. We didn't, nobody went downtown in those days. It was considered dangerous and scary, and there were, all kinds of ugliness things waiting for you. And we did 3 test shows. Herbie Mann and Ramsey Lewis was the third. And people just immediately fell in love with the building. And so we pooled our money, which was $4,500. 3 grown men really doing well at that time. And we began to take over the lease in April 15th of 1975. What had happened, to back up about a few months before that, was Charlie Root called and said, "John, Interstate wants out. They've had it. They're losing money. They had ceased to maintain the building for years. And if you want it, you got to take it now." And I mean literally now. And so we had, we weren't ready. We had no business plan. We didn't even know what a business plan was, And here we were faced with taking over this 500,000 cubic foot building on downtown property with historic dimensions on several levels. And we pulled what little money we had together and we started. We were bankrupt in 2 weeks. But it's true, we really were. But thank God for credit and the bank, and we were able to borrow, pay back, borrow, pay back, borrow, pay back. We did not have any money. We did not have any sponsors. We didn't have any fat cats. We didn't have any, rich woman in the corridor. We didn't have the government. We had nobody knew us from Adam, really, and not many people really believed in the project. Even the arts community was very disdainful of it. So we had to get in there and immediately operate. We couldn't sit around and wait for the grant to come in the door. And I digress for a moment. So we didn't have the luxury of immediately having financing or grants or anything, and we had to operate the theater as best we could to prove to the public that it worked, get people turned on, show what the possibilities were in order to survive, so that we could go out and find grant money to get it restored. So that was about the first 3 years of the process. We lived on hot dogs and popcorn. We really did. And but exactly so. We did. I may tell you another story later on about that, but that's pretty interesting. But as we got into it, and it was obvious that we were generating incredible press, reams of press and television stories and what have you, so that the public was very focused in on what we were doing. We were able to start cracking loose with some money, and a very unique thing that we did, actually, was 2 things. One had to do with the city of Austin for about $120,000, and then the other one had to do with the Economic Development Administration which is a department of the Department of Commerce. And they had never funded an arts-related project in their life. They were into port authorities, railroads, transportation systems, convention centers. Their bag was put people to work that were not working to decrease unemployment. And any way they could do that, they would seize upon those kind of projects. So we actually had, what had happened was with the city of Austin, this is an interesting story, we had an equity Broadway show coming in from New York called Guys and Dolls. It was the all-black Guys and Dolls show, and we had sold out 2 shows. It was and it shouldn't even have played the theater. It was way too big for the theater, and our dressing rooms didn't meet code for the union, and so they said, well, we're going to let you slide if you put trailers in the alley. So we put these trailers in the alley, literally the kind that, like the Winnebago type trailers that you can fire up and so forth, so that because it was in the dead of summer, and the cast had to have air conditioning, so we ran electrical back there. I mean, it was a nightmare really what we ended up having to do. But what happened is in the process is that the Actors Equity Association threatened to blackball the Paramount because we didn't meet a number of criteria, and we really didn't. The backstage was an absolute horror. It made Vincent Price's movies look like something on Fifth Avenue. And the press that was generated and the fear of the closing of the theater for equity touring theater, which was a major part of programming for a historic theater, was real. And we got big headlines, and we got to go before the council, pleaded our case, and they let loose with $120,000, which was the first grant that we got. And we basically brought up the backstage area, brought it up to safety code, and did the dressing rooms, put in restrooms and lavatories and what have you, and it generated such a groundswell of support amongst the public that it really kind of set us on our way. The second part of that answer is the Economic Development Administration, the EDA, Department of Commerce, was into these things I talked about earlier, putting people to work, and we were able to convince them that we were just as worthy as any other large construction project, and with a lot of wrangling and sitting on people's doorsteps and whining and cajoling and whatever it took over a period of time, we got them to let loose with a $650,000 grant, and then they actually ended up funding about $1,800,000 of the theater's restoration, and we were the first one in the country, to my knowledge, to actually get a grant for a theater project from the Department of Commerce.
Let me ask you this, Art. Why is it important that these buildings have a second chance?
I think that anything that preserves our legacy as a people is extremely important, whether that's the Mayan ruins of Chichen Itza, or whether that's the Plaza Theater in El Paso, or whether that's Carnegie Hall, or whatever it might be. The road to our future lies in our past. There are many things about our past, frankly, that we did better than we do today. And the theater construction techniques of the turn of the century up through the early 30s, when most of these theaters were built by Interstate and other companies, represented really the height in the technology of that time. And frankly, even with all of the whistles and bells and the advanced technology of acousticians available to this day, I cannot think of a theater that has been built since 1930 that remotely has the presence and the ambience and the electricity, the soul, the fire that is essential and a part of these historic theaters. In fact, it is as much a part of the show experience as the show, and not only from the audience's standpoint, but from the performer's standpoint. Mandy Patinkin from Broadway, the world's greatest Broadway star living today, would rather play in the Paramount Theater than play in the Wortham Center, in Dallas, and there's a good reason for it. the electricity and the exchange with the audience is incredible. Forgetting the artistic part of it and the legacy part of it, the Paramount Theater, it would be fair to say, was a major catalyst in the revitalization of downtown Austin. In 1975, when we started, many buildings were boarded up. People were truly afraid to go downtown. More of that was perception than reality, but it was very quiet at 5:30. I mean, it was like something like on the beach. All the cars were gone, you know. And because of the fact that a theater is a tremendous attractor of people, and I guess the Paramount drew 100,000 people a year minimum, and still does, maybe more, probably a lot more actually. You get people coming back into the downtown area. So what happens next? Now restaurants start coming back, and clubs, and office buildings, and eateries, and grocery stores, and all the things that one you would normally get in the suburb, you know. Again, we're talking about a cyclical situation where our society moves to the suburbs away from the urban center. Urban centers kind of collapse and decay, and they come back to the urban center because why? The urban center has things that the suburb can never have. It can never have a depth and a soul like these inner cities, whatever they may be. Even some of the smallest ones have just a tremendous charisma down in the inner city. And so there is no telling, it'd be impossible to know what kind of economic impact the restoration of the Paramount had on the surrounding downtown, but I can tell you that while we were not the only one, or the only project that had to do with that, the banks made a decision to stay downtown, which was a big, important decision at the time. But they are tremendous anchors to generating an audience, and an audience of the kind that spends money in the area.
That's a very good part of what you've been doing too. I know that some cities who own structures like this have a tendency to look at theaters and wonder, how can this ever be economically feasible? Will it really generate enough income to support itself, to grow?
Well, I'm not an economist, but it'd be interesting to know how much tax dollars are lost due to decay in downtown areas versus potentially underwriting to some degree a theater, together with its earned income potential from ticket sales and concessions and what have you. One might find that there's a 10-to-1 ratio or a 100-to-1 ratio in that regard, wherein it would be cheaper and much more economically sensible to restore a theater and keep the downtown thriving than to have decay and crime. The cost of crime is huge, vandalism, huge, both in financial dollars and in terms of just the angst for people who are in the area. I think that would be an interesting study to do, but it doesn't really need to be studied because any person with common sense will know that it's better to have an active inner city with anchors like theaters blazing the way with wonderful lights and exciting shows and people beautifully dressed and going downtown and going to restaurants afterwards, and the hubbub and the buzz, cars and the action and excitement, kind of like a mini version of Times Square in New York. They really have a profound impact beyond the historic ramifications. I'll give you an example of the downside of this. Houston, Texas, one of the most modern cities in the world, booming metropolis, to be sure, 4 or 5 million people, tore down all 3 of its historic theaters. And in its place, there are 2 parking lots, to my knowledge, and there are some contemporary theaters that are beautiful for what they are, but they will never, ever have the opportunity to revisit what they had to begin with. You could never build it again. They simply do not have the money and the artisans to know really what to do. I find that to be a great tragedy, and that was happening and had happened while we were starting the Paramount as well. And it gave us a lot of, in fact, the Hancock Theater in Austin was torn down, which was a beloved theater in Austin, a smaller opera house, a true opera house. And a lot of people got very upset about that happening, and the Paramount was the last of the bunch. So thank God, it was really going to be a Holiday Inn. That's what I was told when we were, looking at it. Somebody said they were going to raise it and put a Holiday Inn there on downtown Congress Avenue. And I think that would have been pretty. Nothing against Holiday Inn, by the way, but I think that there's other places they could go and not have to take down these incredible buildings, which are completely irreplaceable, just like an Egyptian tomb might be, or some other antiquity. They are living antiquities.
Did you get any feedback from people who would come to the shows in terms of their remembering having gone there as children, and just that the part you talked about anchoring, very happy that had been preserved.
Well, there's no question about this. I mean, I met scores of people. I'm from San Antonio originally, and as I said, and I was not really well ensconced in Austin. I came to the University of Texas, graduated in radio, television, and film, and communications, and I was very young when I started this. I didn't know people. I didn't have power. Didn't have political connections. Was not socially prominent, what have you. And I met people the old-fashioned way, by doing, and by them walking through the lobby and telling me things. Governor Briscoe and his wife dated in the Paramount Theater, which also had something to do with him letting go of some money. But more than that, though, is the nostalgic. It's more than nostalgia, though. It's a very heartwarming experience to revisit the place of one's youth. And inside of that theater, life has stood still. To this day, when they show Casablanca, or Singing in the Rain, or An American in Paris, which they do oftentimes, believe me, it is as though nothing has changed since 1930 or 1940. Not many places you can think of can give you that kind of time warp or time transport experience. I heard, just dozens and dozens of people commented upon. I went there in college. We used to go see this. I remember going to a premiere with John Wayne, who was in town for whatever the movie was. I mean, I saw Sally Rand. This is somebody else speaking, told me that they saw Sally Rand. A very funny story about Sally, that apparently she was never supposed to be hit with a white spot. And the union projectionist, don't mean to bash the union, wasn't paying attention and hit her with a white spot, and she apparently trudged from the stage through the audience, cursing the entire way like a sailor, to the projection booth and ate this guy out for like 5 minutes, and went back to the stage and finished her performance. This is what I've been told. And all these stories, you see these people transported in their mind back to a time that was more innocent, a time of wonder and awe, a time when you walked into a building like this as a kid and you were dumbstruck, just like almost like landing on the moon. I mean, it was that kind of an environment. And what is that worth to people? I mean, each one of those moments for an individual must be worth $1 million, because it's a feeling that you cannot get any way other than being able to revisit your past. And I feel very strongly that we are not that smart today in many ways. There's a lot to be learned from the past, going back as far as you want to go. We think we've gotten smart, but we've actually gotten stupid in a lot of ways. And one of the ways to be smart is to maintain the preservation of these kinds of facilities.
Have you worked with other interstate theaters in Texas?
Yes, I have worked with some other interstate theaters in Texas. Of course, we've done consulting work on the Plaza Theater in El Paso, which is a stunning 2,000-seat. I'm sorry, I forgot where we were.
Yeah, the question was, have you done any other
yes.
consulting work with other interstate
Talk about-
theaters in Texas?
I was saying that I had indeed been involved and fortunate enough to consult on the Majestic Theater restoration in San Antonio, the Hippodrome restoration in Waco, and the Plaza Theater in El Paso. Happily, the Majestic and the Hippodrome both actually opened, were restored, and are incredible assets to both of those cities. Regrettably, the Plaza Theater, which is really one of the top 5 in the state of Texas, is closed to this day, and it's really a tragedy. The theater is just wilting away, chunk by chunk, and yet to this day, I could go in there in a month and we could produce a major star on that stage. It might not smell perfect, okay? It'd be a little musty, but I promise you the magic would be there to this moment. And I do believe that that the city of El Paso is missing a bet, because I don't think they truly understand the power that emanates from a legitimate theater like this operating at optimum. And in that market, it really can. And actually offers some interesting opportunities from a programmatic standpoint in Hispanic type programming, which not even San Antonio, I don't think, could actually pull off. And I think it would including television, by the way. And we've done a lot of work on that particular project. The El Paso Community Foundation saved that theater, bought that theater from whoever the owner was at the time. To my knowledge, put $1,200,000 into the project minimum, offered the city of El Paso $200,000 a year for 10 years to subsidize the operation of the theater, which is plenty to go along with the earned income, and performed like no foundation I have ever been around in my life. I think it would do well for the citizens of El Paso and the city of El Paso and the businessmen of El Paso to realize what a friend and a champion they have in the form of the El Paso Community Foundation. And if they'll do right by them and get there with them arm in arm, that theater can be opened and can be one of the great showplaces of the country. I'll tell you also that El Paso is strategically located geographically, as far as ground tours go, tours that move around by bus, what's called bus and truck. It's a big jump from Dallas to Phoenix, or from Dallas to Albuquerque, and El Paso is a market that the industry really needs. And they do have a civic center there. I can't remember what size it is, and it's available, and I think that things go through there from time to time. But again, it really is limiting for a city of that size to have one building, which when used for a convention or something can't be used for a touring play or a musical or a major star coming through. And I know the industry would really welcome having the Plaza Theater come on board and get into the route between Texas and California, which is how they normally traverse back and forth.
Just as a closing statement, is there anything you want to say about the theaters, about their importance to history, that you wanted to leave an audience with?
Well, I guess I'd like to say two things. One is that no matter how important a project is and how many people agree it's important, it takes one person with vision, with the fire in the belly, with determination, with unbelievable passion, fortitude, stick-to-itiveness, the ability to be told no 500 times and go back to the 501st and say, yes, but you didn't quite understand what I was saying and how important it is that you help us. There must be such a person in any kind of a performing arts organization, to be sure, and many other parts of life as well, that is the catalyst, that is the burning ember that never lets go. Day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, constantly hitting the brick wall to make the deal go forward. That is a critical ingredient in any of these theaters generally you will find, or opera companies, or ballet companies, or professional theater companies. That is a really incredibly important thing, because I tell you, it is a huge amount of work, and you need someone who is absolutely undaunted by the task at hand and is so passionate in their belief and so clear in their vision of what they see happening that they infect all people around them with this wonder and awe and the excitement of what can be.
Let me ask you this, and just one last question to kind of tie it into Interstate 2. You said that you had met some of the Interstate executives. Did you what kind of sense did you get about what kind of company that they had built?
Rocco, you need to not make a move until I finish this, okay? Not a move. How they felt. You were asking me how did some of the interstate theater managers and administrators feel about what we were doing,
Or just what impression did you get of them as managers and as visionaries in terms of the theater?
Well, I didn't meet Louis Novi, who was a critically important person in the Paramount's history during the 1930s and the 1940s, which is really during its zenith with Carl Habelsel. Louis Novi was an incredibly powerful man, went way beyond Austin. In fact, his son Earl Podolnik built several theaters here in town and around the state called Trans-Texas Theaters. And Louis was connected into Hollywood because Mr. Habelsel was connected into Hollywood, and because of all the touring shows that they bought and financed and to bring into their theaters. They had a lot of power. And but I think that Mr. Novi was an incredible persona and was Mr. Paramount during his reign. And I think a man like that had a tremendous amount to do with the Paramount being a fabric of everyday life. Whether it was a world premiere with John Wayne, or a governor in town speaking at a political convention, or the Rangerettes, or a high school graduation, or whatever thing might have been, I mean, Sally Rand or Cab Calloway coming to town, or some momentous occasion. This was like town hall, town square in its own way. In fact, more so. Without people like without Louis Novi and Carl Habelsel and the other men and women around the country who ran these theaters and built these theaters, had the vision to do this, the vision and the guts. A lot of these theaters were built during the Depression. When the whole world had crashed, these people were out building unbelievable buildings that cost mammoth amounts of money at the time. And I think that took a lot of guts. And I think we owe them a great debt of gratitude. Beyond that, I think the Interstate Theater chain was extremely professional and very slick. It was a machine when Mr. Habelsel was alive. I cannot speak to that issue so much after ABC bought him out, and I'm not really clear on a lot of how that worked, but during their heyday, they were a rolling ball of butcher knives. They didn't miss a trick. And in fact, they left us a legacy at the Paramount. We found a number of files, meticulous files, and in those files were envelopes, and in those envelopes were copies of the bills for the show statements of Cab Calloway and of these various people. And I got to tell you, that was pretty groovy, being able to go through that. And they paid Cab $2,000, Well, $2,000 in 1939 was like $200,000 today, It was huge money. And really an incredible company. And I did not know Bill Curtis and some of the gentlemen in Dallas very well. I did meet Mr. Harris, Lynn Harris, several times, and he was a guiding light, to be sure, for the Habelsel Foundation, and I believe assisted in the restoration of the Grand in Galveston. But if they could all be like Charlie Root, who is the person I knew the best, you couldn't find a finer person to be a manager and a protector of this great legacy that they left us behind. He embodied the professionalism of a theater manager anywhere in the country, together with that kind of Jimmy Stewart quality of being all-American and of being a genuinely caring person about the community and what was happening and how the theater interrelated with it and could help it and be a part of it. What's the old saying? Where do we find such men and women?